Chapter 19. Simon. Simon gazed out the window toward the ruins of the old Roman wall, without seeing it, but knowing that Cora's carriage appearing around that corner would be his first sighting of her arrival. In fact, he'd sat at his desk staring out the window toward the front drive for most of the day, waiting for a carriage that would bring her to Leavensfield Court. Anticipation thrummed through his veins. It had been a week and a day since he'd held her at the ball, 7 days since they'd sat together on the bridge, a day since he'd written a letter to her, and not even a minute since he'd last thought of her. He worried if he'd made a mistake, arranging the hunt in haste. He would have hunted whether or not he had guests. They would simply make it more enjoyable. This house party wasn't designed as a social event. The guests were a small list, and attention hadn't been given for equal numbers. He had arranged meals and the hunts, but left the remaining time for the guests to entertain themselves. Before noon, the red and black box of Aunt Nellie's carriage waddled around the wall and continued up his road behind 4 horses. He stood in the foyer to greet his guests. Seconds ticked by like minutes. How long could it take for the short drive? Just as he decided to return to the window to check on their progress, the door opened. Simon stood frozen in place as he watched Cora cross the threshold. She wasn't just coming to his home. It was as if she were coming home. His chest filled with air that seemed to glow with light, pushing warmth throughout his body. At that moment, Simon didn't care where she was born. He didn't care what society thought his responsibility toward marriage might be. He didn't consider his family's opinion on the matter either. No. All he knew was that she was here at his request. Profound appreciation and desire filled him. Cora smiled at him from across the foyer, her eyes twinkling as stray curly blonde locks that had escaped her travelling hat floated around her face. He was lost. Behind him, his mother cleared her throat. "Invite our guests into the green salon, please." Simon opened his mouth to make an introduction, but his mother waved him off and then continued with her gaze fixed on Cora. "You needn't bother with an introduction. We've met, and I doubt her manners have improved." Then her attention swung to her son. "She's American, after all." With an exaggerated sniff, his mother briskly turned to the salon, and Simon faced Cora to apologize. He'd deal with his mother later. To his surprise, Cora had a growing smirk on her lips. "I'm trying not to smile, but the most I'm accomplishing is not to laugh. Apparently, our last meeting was memorable for your mother." Before he could ask about it, more guests entered the house. He greeted each and directed them to the salon. While Simon spoke with Everett's mother, May took Cora by the arm, and off they went. The group gathering in the salon was generally lively, though it had been a 2-day trip from Twickenham to St. Albans, sleeping over in Edgware. After a spot of tea, Simon's mother announced they would be shown to their rooms to freshen themselves for an early dinner. Of course, she started in order of precedence, leaving Cora to be settled last. For once, Simon appreciated his mother's strict formality. "I arranged for you to be assigned to the rose room," Simon whispered. "It overlooks the formal gardens above the roses. On the wall is a landscape painting of one of my favourite places on the estate. I'm interested in hearing your interpretation of the picture. Perhaps your insight on whether or not I should have it reframed as well." He didn't notice Cora taking any extra meaning from his statement when she said, "I would like to compare the painting to the location that inspired it. If we have time for such an outing, that is." "I'd be pleased to escort you." He leaned closer and whispered, "There is a letter behind it for you." At that, her eyes brightened, and she graced him with a coquettish grin. Too soon, his mother sent Cora off with a servant. Before he could leave the room, his mother stepped in front of him. "Have you the inclination to embarrass yourself and this family? You must disentangle yourself before we are an on it in every drawing-room in London." "I'm not entangled nor engaged, Mother." "Of course not, given the guest list. And the one person trying to get her claws into you is unfit to be your Duchess." When Simon opened his mouth to retort to her accusation, she shushed him, saying,
I have it on good authority, so you'd best not try to deny the time you have spent with that American."
Simon considered the coz his mother had seemed to have with Lady Radnor during tea. Neither woman was generous toward him, and he expected that Lady Radnor threw the shadiest light on every situation that came to her memory concerning Simon and Cora. He was happy for Everett that Lucy was nothing like her mother.
"I hardly need to remind you that I'm a man and not a boy. Your advice on my personal life is unwelcome."
She shook her head slowly, and for a moment Simon hoped that she finally understood his position as head of the family. When her chin rose, he saw the familiar, dismissive pity in her eyes. "You were never raised to be a duke, and you're making a muddle of it. It's evident you need guidance." She turned and walked to the door.
"I won't tolerate your judgment or opinion about the company I keep."
Simon kept his tongue about the other matter she raised. He often wondered if he was unfit to be duke. The back of his mind whispered, yes. It was no matter, since he was, and he had to make the best of it. Still, the blow from his mother ached.
"You're too kind by half to that little misfit. If you don't know how to free yourself, I'll put my mind to it." "I won't hear of it, Mother."
"No, you probably won't." With those words hanging in the room, she left. Simon wondered what she meant by them. He imagined that she was condescending toward him due to his lack of hearing. But it could also be that she had never involved herself much in his life, and besides some pointed advice, he doubted she would act differently now. Still, he would be glad when his sisters returned home and took her attention away from him. He committed to renovating the Dowager House on the other side of the estate earlier than previously planned. The new roof could begin immediately, with decorating following on its heels. She could be settled there when she returned from London's little season in 2 months' time. He set himself to writing letters to tradesmen until it was time to change. When the group gathered for dinner, Simon noted the seating arrangement had Cora too far from him for conversation, and a large bouquet centerpiece obscured his vision of her as well. It wasn't until after the meal that he would get to speak with her. He called for the soup to be served, then found himself hurrying through that offering and each that followed. This might be the fastest dinner the house had experienced in its 600-year history. When the ladies separated from the men and the servants appeared with port to be served, he announced, "We won't linger this evening, gentlemen. No doubt the women found the travel fatiguing and will seek their beds early." The eyes of a few men were round with surprise, but Everett's looked as if he was laughing behind them. He might feel the same as Simon, answering in agreement.
"Let's join the ladies."
The women appeared to have barely settled as they walked into the drawing-room. Simon particularly appreciated his mother's apparent surprise. Simon's eyes quickly found Cora standing at the far end of the room as he stated,
"We missed your company, ladies."
The group dispersed, settling into small conversations, and Simon considered the best way to gain Cora's company. He greeted each grouping around the room, though briefly. He hoped the conversations didn't seem as hurried as he knew they were. Each time he moved from a group, Everett stepped into his place. With his obligation satisfied, Simon joined Cora and May, who quickly excused herself. "I haven't had a moment to myself yet to retrieve your letter, so I'm very curious about it. You mentioned that it reveals a special location," Cora said. "Is it a place we could visit?" Simon nodded at the question. Cora asked, "Will you satisfy that curiosity tomorrow?"
"Of which location do you speak?"
Simon's mother spoke over his right shoulder. He turned to find her taking a final step to join them.
"Nothing of interest," he answered.
Was her plan for the coming days to interrupt his every conversation with Cora?
"As I expected. You've a room of guests you invited, as a surprise to me. Since you didn't engage me to be the hostess, or even tell me you were having a party, see to them yourself. You don't have the privilege of secluding yourself in a corner."
Although Simon doubted that his mother's concern was for the other guests, he extended his arm to Cora and escorted her to a group. Within the hour, more than a few of the ladies yawned behind their fans. Everett approached Simon. "I'd like to make use of your office for a meeting with Lord Radnor if you won't be using it." Everett's expression seemed confident, but a wavering edge to his words revealed some apprehension. "I asked him for a meeting, but I have to let him know the place." "Of course. Does Lucy know?" "I told her I'd be meeting with him. I made clear my affection for her, but I didn't ask the question. Not yet." Nervous energy snaked through Simon's muscles, even though it wasn't his happiness being determined. He clapped Everett on the back. "Good luck." The next morning, at the appointed time, Simon led Cora out the door on their adventure to find the mystery location. The driveway scooted alongside the kitchen garden and then further out to the formal gardens. Cora nudged him and pointed toward the small pavilion with white Roman columns, where Everett and Lucy stood within each other's arms. Simon decided that she must have said yes. "I suppose they're engaged now. Should we be hearing an announcement soon?" Cora smiled up at Simon. "How long are typical engagements?" 2 weeks if they register civilly, 3 weeks if they have banns read, or only days if Everett purchases a special license." "That wouldn't surprise me, and Lucy would probably welcome it." "Indeed." Simon imagined he would feel much the same. It was only a 2-mile walk to Nanny Kate's cottage, but the road was slippery and full of puddles from the rain last night. Simon and Cora would have been a muddy mess by the time they arrived. Instead, they sat atop the coracle, well out of the way of the muck flicking to the road behind them. The large wheels sloshed and sucked in the mud, and the horses' feet did the same. As Simon approached the field overlooking the small cottages belonging to the tenants, he began taking measure of each building, checking the thatch of the roofs, the slant of any walls, the condition of the rock fences, even which homes had smoke in the stack and which didn't. He made a mental list of repairs he thought might be needed soon, as well as tenants he needed to check on. He'd have to get back here soon with his estate manager. "Stop!" Cora rose to her feet, holding Simon's shoulder to steady herself as he pulled the horses to a stop. "This is it!" Her face was bright at her discovery. "The picture in my room!" She pointed along the horizon. "The small hill, the stand of trees just there, and the river. There are more homes, but this is the place, isn't it?" "It is." "I can see why you wanted a hunting party to come out here," Cora said, pointing to the trees and fields on her right. "There are redbirds everywhere. Are they on the list for hunting?" "Yes." Simon turned to see where she pointed. "Those are red grouse. The hunting season for them starts August 1st, so we'll hunt rabbits now and then grouse. If we don't, the estate will be overrun and I'll have to give the fields over to them entirely." Cora looked at him with wonder in her expression. "There are so many." "Yes, we've fed them well this year on the remnants of the harvest. The tenants have had a good crop. If we want that next year, many of these birds have to go." Cora sat back down, and Simon called to the horse to move on. She was quiet. A little furrow formed between her brows. Simon wondered what she was considering, but waited to see if she would speak up. He could see his destination down the road, and excitement was building for him to make this important introduction to Cora. Simon pulled the curricle to the side of the road in front of the small home, jumped from his seat, and tethered his horse to a tree that would allow it to graze on the grass nearby. Then he turned to Cora to help her from her seat. The high-seated curricle made for an uneasy descent for women and the full skirts they wore, but Cora gathered them in one hand, then placed her boot on the topmost mounting step. "Catch me," she called as she sprang from the step. Simon's hand circled her waist, and he slowed her jump. In the end, she was face to face with him as she slid down his length to the ground. "That's quite a step." Her words sounded deliciously breathy. If they were somewhere more private, he might take advantage of her being so near. He thought the look in her eye said that she might as well. Simon stepped back and offered his arm to Cora. "There's someone I'd like you to meet." They walked up the path. The cottage door opened, and a gangly youth came out. "Thomas, is that you?" Simon asked. The young man's head dipped. "Aye.
Mom is putting on some tea and asked me to see you in.
Simon extended his hand.
You know, the last time I saw you, you were no higher than this.
It hovered around his waist.
You were wet up to your knees and you had a hat full of fish.
Yes, Your Grace. Poaching, I was. Thomas pulled his hat from his head and wrung it in his hands.
It seemed like a good time to give you leave to go fishing on the estate.
My mum still keeps that letter.
Miss Ray, may I introduce you to Tom Cooper? Tom, this is Miss Ray.
Pleased to meet you, miss. He led them back to the house. This way, Your Grace. Together they entered the cool shadow of the modest home. Is that my Simon? The familiar voice called from the kitchen as if echoing from his past. My Simon. The words enlarged his heart. The woman standing inside the kitchen was his support, his solid footing in a family and home where he was at the margin. With Nanny Kate, he was loved and protected and doted upon. Here in this cottage, more than in Leavensfield Court, Nanny Kate was the family he always came home to. When Simon had been sent off to school, her services were no longer needed as a nanny. She married and quickly had 2 children. The oldest was a daughter who would be about 17 now, and the second was the young man who had greeted them. Simon was happy that she'd had the opportunity to have children. She was a doting mother to him as well as her own. She was older now than his memories had preserved her. Grey hair had completely overcome the brown. Her eyes had little lines that deepened when she smiled, but were as bright as he remembered. They sat together in her kitchen, the 2 women he loved the most, sharing oatcakes and a kettle of tea. He knew that this woman's good opinion of Cora was more important to him than that of his own mother. From the easy conversation and frequent laughs, there was acceptance on both sides. My daughter, Kirsten, is getting married, she said. Oh, it won't be a fancy affair, but we're happy just the same. He's been the apprentice of the blacksmith.
When is the wedding?
Simon asked. In a few days, she remarked, refilling Cora's cup. Simon reached out and patted the older woman's hand that rested on the table near him.
I'd like to provide a dinner if you'll allow me, he said.
He noticed the older woman's eyes becoming cloudy, and her other hand settled the kettle, then rested on top of his with a gentle squeeze. You'd do that for us, would you?
And more. I'll see a small amount settled on her husband as well. I only need to know how many people will attend, and I'll have my staff begin preparations.
You're a good one, you are, Simon. She lifted her apron and swiped the cloth across her eyes. The visit concluded, and they were back in his curricle and underway home. They'd been silent for a few moments when Cora said, This is your favourite place on the estate because of Nanny Kate, isn't it? Simon nodded and answered,
You can't choose your family, but she did choose me.
He reached back to his earliest memories and continued.
Nanny Kate was there. She anchored me to my past and even now gives me strength, confidence that somehow I'll be able to do this.
She probably knew you better than many others and knew your character. Her words and smile encouraged him to go on.
My father had dismissed me as irrelevant, possibly as soon as I was born. My mother didn't seem to care about nurturing until years later when my sisters arrived, and my brothers seemed to be aware of the family's indifference, only noticing me to mock me. But Nanny Kate was my rock.
I'm so glad you had her. Cora hugged his left arm.
Simon was too. She taught and counselled me, and if I needed help, she would try to find a way. She could coax a smile or laugh from me, even on the saddest days. When death altered my family and my future specifically, Nanny Kate was the only one who put her arms around me with tenderness and understanding.
Thank you for introducing us. It's an honour. Their carriage topped the small rise and sloshed back through the mud toward Leavensfield. In the drive, Simon recognised his sisters, Lady Atkins and Wetheridge, arriving. He'd chosen this week for the hunting party because his family had plans to be busy in London with whatever affair Lady Atkins had planned. Not only had his mother's plans changed, but apparently his sisters had too, and they brought Weatheridge along. Simon didn't believe in coincidences.